Next, we take you to Boston for a speech by the president of the John Birch Society, John McManus. Mr. McManus discusses the economy, the budget deficit, and the deficit solutions offered by such organizations as the Concord Coalition and Empower America. This event runs about an hour and 40 minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harold Shurtleff, and I'm the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society. We decided to have the event here at the Boston Public Library after I found out that John Kenneth Galbraith had his birthday party here, and I figured, well, if Mr. Galbraith can have his party here, why can't we? We're very delighted to be here tonight. This program is being sponsored by the Boston chapters of the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society has local chapters in every state in the Union, and the purpose of the society is very fundamental. Our goal is to educate the voters, educate the American people, to give them the complete story, a lot of the information that is not readily available. Before we bring up our featured speaker, we'd like to ask you all to stand, and I'm going to invite Pastor Larry Pender of the Open Bible Baptist Church to open in prayer. Pastor Larry.
Heavenly Father, we want to just dedicate this time to you as we pursue truth and knowledge. I pray that you would give our speaker clarity of thought and clarity of speech as well, Lord, that we might become better educated, that we might be better citizens in our country, better Christians. I just pray your blessing upon this time. Lord, I pray that this time would be used to draw our country back to truth, back to its foundations, back to the heritage of our forefathers. Bless our speaker now. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Please remain standing for... Now I want to introduce or bring up Mr. Marian Juskov, former resident of Czechoslovakia, now a U.S. citizen, and a proud member of the John Birch Society, to lead in the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Juskov.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. Be seated now. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Society or wish to stay on our mailing list or get on our mailing list, we do have a list over there. Please put your name and address. And for those of you who may be watching this around the country, please, at the end of the film, or at the end of the tape, there will be an address, our Appleton, Wisconsin address. Now, to introduce our speaker, Mr. Ted Maravelis. Ted is no stranger to controversy. He is a graduate of UMass Amherst, and I guess he was quite the controversial leader, a conservative leader on campus. In 1992, he was a Republican nominee for state representative, and he is the host of his own show called America First in Danvers. Mr. Maravelis, please.
Thank you, Al. Thank you for coming here tonight. Let me give you a brief biography on our speaker, Mr. McManus. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, received a BS in physics from Holy Cross College, served 3 years as a Marine Corps officer, and began a career as an electronics engineer in 1960, and joined the John Birch Society in 1964. In 1966, he left the engineering profession and accepted a full-time position with the Society. He served in a variety of posts and has been the organization's chief spokesman since 1973. In June 1991, he was named president of the Society. He is an author, a speaker, a film and television producer, an editor, and a radio and television spokesman. His latest book, as you will see tonight, is entitled Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America Under the Threat of Bankruptcy. But in addition to the speaker's past accomplishments, I think something else should be noted. I believe what we have here is a person who personifies what the Founding Fathers struggled to give us 200 years ago. They loved God, they loved family, and they loved country. And I see those same character traits in the speaker tonight. I see a person who has unceasing courage in the face of incredible odds. And again, I believe that this person is a type of modern-day George Washington, who loves the American Republic and wants to see it remain free. I cannot think of a greater American to help spread the word about what's going on in this country. I believe that Mr. McManus and the John Birch Society is the key educational foundation in this country that will help once again secure our liberties, not only for us, but also for our posterity. And so, tonight, with that few words, I'll let the speaker speak for himself. I give you a fellow countryman, a family man, and a friend, Mr. John McManus.
Well, thank you, Ted, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank Ted for reading that just as I wrote it. It's a delight to be here. I'm just winding up a nationwide tour. As some of you know, I've been all over the United States, and happily the audiences are larger and the audiences are more enthusiastic, and we're just delighted with the progress that we're making in the John Birch Society all across the country. Now, you're supposed to start off a speech with a little bit of humor, and I always try to do that, and I'll hope that you appreciate it and hope that you feel that it's worth a little bit of a chuckle here. I heard a story recently about two burglars that were in somebody's home, and they were going ahead and loading up their bags, and all of a sudden they heard a voice saying, "The Lord is with you." And they looked at each other very quickly, and then flashlight around the room, and all of a sudden they shone on a parrot. And as they did, the parrot said, "The Lord is with you." So they looked at each other and said, "Oh, we don't have anything to worry about. It's just a stupid parrot." And he said, "The Lord is with you" again. Well, they kept going, and the parrot kept saying the same thing over and over and over again. So they get the flashlight back, and they're going to try and shut up the parrot. And as they shine the flashlight over there, they see a great big Doberman Pinscher sitting right next to the parrot's cage. And at that point, the parrot said, "Sick 'em, Lord." So things aren't always the way you think they are. I heard a story, too, about a young fellow that went off to Sunday school one day, and as he came home, he told his mother about the wonderful lesson that he'd gotten. And she said, well, tell me all about it, please, tell me all about it. So he said, well, it was about the time when the Jewish people were being chased out of Egypt by the Pharaoh's army. And it was looking bad for them because the Pharaoh's army was catching up. And all of a sudden, they got up against the Red Sea, and they were really in trouble. And the Pharaoh's army's coming down on them. He said, so Moses got on his walkie-talkie, and he called in the Israeli Air Force, and they bombed the Egyptian army. And then the Israeli Navy came across the sea and picked them up and took them to safety. Well, his poor mother rolled her eyes and looked at him, and she said, is that what they taught you in Sunday school? And he said, well, no, Mom, but if I told you the way they told me, you wouldn't believe it. See, the boy was skeptical about something he should have believed. And here we have in our country today all kinds of people believing a lot of things when we in the John Birch Society think they should be skeptical. Now, what should they be skeptical about? Well, let's be skeptical for a few moments about the monetary system that we use here in the United States of America. Let's be skeptical about the Federal Reserve System. And in order to demonstrate why we should be skeptical about it, let's go back to the foundation of it, and we go back to the fall of 1910, and we see that there are 7 individuals who are associated in one way or another with the banking empires in New York City, each of them told to proceed independently to a railroad car over in New Jersey across the Hudson River from Manhattan. The 7 were told to go independently and make sure that you weren't seen one to the other, to make sure that nobody knew where you were going and who you were going to join up with. And there was great secrecy, extraordinary secrecy involved in the whole event. Now, they were told to proceed to the railroad car, and the railroad car was owned by one of the individuals who was of the 7, and that was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, one of whose descendants became Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. The railroad car that they would proceed to was, in fact, owned by Senator Aldrich. Now, the others were 3 from the J.P. Morgan banking interests, 1 from the Rockefeller banking interests, 1 was an assistant secretary of the United States Treasury. Senator Aldrich himself was there, and the 7th man was Paul Warburg from Germany, who was an agent of the Rothschild banking empire in Europe. Now, we know a lot about the details of this because one of the individuals, a man named Frank Vanderlip, who was the Rockefeller banker, He wrote an article about it 25 years down the road, in fact, in 1935, in the Saturday Evening Post. And in that article, he said he felt very much like a conspirator, which I think was a very good choice of words. Now, you can see these individuals proceeding to the railroad car with the collars turned up and the brims on their hat down and maybe even sunglasses. And each of them was told that when you get there, don't refer to the other by a last name, use a nickname or use a first name, and do everything you possibly can to be anonymous, secret. Well, the purpose of the gathering was to take the train all the way to Georgia. And then they disembarked in Georgia and they went to a resort called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. The purpose of the gathering was to lay the foundations for the Federal Reserve in the United States of America. A central bank, something that we had flirted with in our country on two separate occasions early in the history of our nation. Both times the decision was made to not have a central bank, not put all of the power of a central bank together into any repository, allow free enterprise, in other words. Now, the individuals who were there were operating on the dictum of the great leader of the founder of the Rothschild Empire, a man named Meyer Amschel Rothschild, who 200 years before our time stated, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." Now, is that a reasonable assertion? I think it is, and I think we'll demonstrate along the way here that it is. If you have control of a nation's money, you really don't care who makes its laws, because they will make the laws according to the way you want the laws made. The purpose of the gathering, to establish the legislation, to put together legislation that would lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve in our country. And let's state right here at the beginning that they succeeded. They certainly did. The Federal Reserve was actually passed and voted into law by Congress and signed by the President on December 22nd of 1913. And the date is significant because that's 3 days before Christmas, when many of the individuals who were opponents of the Federal Reserve and a whole idea of a central bank had already vacated Washington. Many of them go back to their districts in the West or the South in order to celebrate the Christmas holidays in their home districts. Those who stayed back were proponents of the Fed, and many of them from the liberal Northeast, where there was sentiment for this. Now, the Fed was created. Now, I want to state right at the beginning here that the Federal Reserve is not a government entity. Yes, it's true that the President gets to name the man who is the head of the Federal Reserve. He gets to name the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. But just because of that, it does not make it a federal agency. It is no more a federal agency than is the package delivering company called Federal Express. The President names them, yes, but somebody from the Federal Reserve will come before and say, here's who we want you to name. If you go to Washington, D.C., just a little bit of a tidbit of information here, you can look on a phone book down there, and they have great listings for all the government agencies, and you will look in vain for the Federal Reserve in the listing of federal agencies. It's not there. Now, the Federal Reserve has the power over the economic life of our nation. It can set the amount of currency, and it therefore controls the value of the currency, as we shall see. It can control the interest rates in our country. It does control the banking business in our country, setting the rules under which banks operate. It has, in fact, an economic life grip on the United States of America. There have been many congressmen over the years who have tried to expose the Federal Reserve, tried to get inside it, tried to even find out who really owns it and how its decision-making process is arrived at. One of those was the powerful head of the House Banking Committee, a congressman from Texas named Wright Patman, who in 1968 had tried quite diligently to open up the Fed, to get control of the Fed in the interests of the people, and had failed. And so he wrote a letter to his constituents in 1968, and I have a copy of the text in my book here. We're talking about my book, Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America Under the Threat of Bankruptcy. So what did Wright Patman say? He wrote a letter to his constituents. Here we are, 1968. He said this: in the United States today, we have in effect two governments. We have the duly constituted government, that being the Congress, the courts, the president, so on. Then he said, we have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve System, operating the money powers which are reserved to the Congress by the Constitution. The very powerful head of the House Banking Committee. That was 1968. Well, 1 year later, we now have the Nixon administration was in force, and a new Secretary of the Treasury had taken office, a man named David M. Kennedy. And so early in 1969, U.S. News and World Report interviewed David M. Kennedy in a question and answer format. And here's the question. Mr. Kennedy, do you approve of the latest credit tightening moves of the Federal Reserve? And the answer from the Secretary of Treasury of the United States of America, it's not my job to approve or disapprove, he said. It's the action of the Federal Reserve. So here we have a completely uncontrolled body that has vast power. Now it has power to create a boom. It has power to create a bust, or you can call it an uptick and a little bit of a recession. It can do so as it pleases, and it has done so. And it has also done so just prior to an election so that it shapes the thinking of many of the voters. Now let me show you some evidence of that. We go to 1988, and we go to the summer of 1988, and we see that the U.S. News and World Report now has an article by one of its writers, a man named Monroe Carman. This is the summer of '88. The decision had already been made by the political parties that the race for president that year would be between Bush and Dukakis. Ronald Reagan was about to finish his 2 terms, couldn't run for re-election. So, Monroe Carman, July 25th, 1988 issue, U.S. News and World Report. He writes this article. He says, in short, the central bank, that being the Federal Reserve, wants to strike a pose of neutrality for the contest between George Bush and Michael Dukakis. The Fed will neither plunge the economy into a recession, as Fed Chairman Paul Volcker did in 1980 to sabotage Jimmy Carter's chances for re-election, nor open up the money spigots wide as Arthur Burns did in 1972 to help Richard Nixon win another term. And you thought you decided who was going to be the President of the United States, didn't you? Now, does that affect the thinking of a lot of voters? Of course it does. The admission is there. In 1984, New York Times columnist William Safire had written very much the same thing. He had said in an article that he wrote in the New York Times, he said, now to the political key. The presidential candidate wants a Fed chairman who will swing a little. Comes the spring of 1984, if interest rates are climbing upward and hurting housing, the incumbent, that being Ronald Reagan, will want a Fed chairman to start shoveling money like mad, even if it upsets conservatives. So here we are saying that, yes, indeed, they do use their power to shape elections. Now, I said that they can set the value of currency. Let me show you why I say that. Sometimes you get some corroboration for your point of view, and it comes from fairly interesting sources, and sometimes from sources that you never would have expected. Here I have National Geographic magazine, 1993, the January of 1993 issue. And there's an article in here by an assistant editor named Peter White. The article is called The Power of Money. And the man has spent a lot of time and effort going around the world and talking about what different countries have used as money, what has been used as money through history, and it's all very interesting. But I think the most interesting part is when he goes to the Federal Reserve. And as he arrives, the Federal Reserve is buying $100 million worth of Treasury bills. So he asks some questions. Where did the Fed get that money, that $1 million? And the answer from the Federal Reserve official is, we created it. It's money that didn't exist before. Is there anybody in the audience that would like that power? Sometimes people put up 2 hands, not just one, right? So he presses on. He asks some more questions. Is there any limit on that power? And the Fed official responds, no limit, only the good judgment and conscience of responsible Federal Reserve people. Sleep well, my friends. He presses on. Where did they get that power, that vast authority? Fed official says it was delegated in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 based on the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to coin money. And he stopped pressing on. Ladies and gentlemen, what does coining money mean? It means taking metal, stamping it into little discs, you drop them on a hard surface and they go clank. Can you do that with paper? No. Can you coin paper? No. But the Federal Reserve does that, doesn't it? And it claims the authority to do it from the congressional authorization to coin money. Can't do that. Congress does indeed have power to coin money. It's in the Constitution of the United States. It does not have the power to transfer its authority to some private body, which is what has been done. And it doesn't have power to coin money, and therefore it can't transfer it, even if it had the power to coin money, to coin paper. So here we have. Now, what happens? How does that $100 million become valuable? The Fed just creates 100, it's not even printing press money, by the way, it's a computer entry. And so the Fed puts out $100 million, and that money takes on value by stealing a little bit of the value of yours and everyone else's. Everyone who has money is defrauded when money is created out of thin air, exactly like that. Now, every one of us knows that the value of the dollar has shrunk. And we see in the newspapers day after day, especially in these times, about the threat of inflation. We have people worrying about inflation. We have the Federal Reserve Chairman saying we've got to raise the interest rates a little bit. In fact, he did that not too long ago, and 0.25% for one category of interest, and the stock market went down 100 points that day, didn't it? That's pretty vast power right there. But where did that money take on value? It took on value by stealing from all of yours. If I, as a boy in 1945, could go to the store for my mother and buy a loaf of bread for a dime, and today I go to the store to buy that loaf of bread and it costs $1.40, is it because the bread is more expensive? No. In fact, the bread is probably less expensive because of advanced production techniques and delivery systems and so on. What has happened is the value of the dollar has shrunk that much. All right? And that's the problem. The value of the dollar has gone down that much. Now, in 1940, I talk about in my book a man who inherited $10,000. And he could have bought a fine home in 1940. But he decided to put the money in the bottom drawer. For whatever his reasons. It's his money, he can do what he wants with it. 50 years later, 1990, he took the $10,000 out of the bottom drawer and he couldn't even put a down payment on a fine home. Where did that value go? That value was stolen from him in a process that socialist John Maynard Keynes once said that not one man in a million could diagnose the problem. Well, that's not true, because the John Birch Society has been telling a lot of people for a lot of years that inflation is not rising prices, which is what we're being told daily. Inflation is an increase in the quantity of currency that causes rising prices because the value of the currency has shrunk. To say that inflation is rising prices is akin to saying wet streets cause rain. They don't. The wet streets are the effect of rain, and the rising prices are the effect of inflation. So what has to be done about this? First of all, the Federal Reserve has an economic grip on our nation that is, it's like a death grip. Secondly, it has illegitimate powers. And it can control elections. It can do all kinds of things to suit itself. And if we go back to Meyer Amschel Rothschild, we realize that give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes its laws. And that's where we are with the Federal Reserve. And so what ought to be done about it? Well, it's not a case of something where you can fix it. It's not a case of getting some good people and putting them in charge. It's totally illegitimate power. The Federal Reserve has to be abolished. And we have to go back to what we had at the time of the Federal Reserve's creation, and that's United States Treasury issued currency fully backed by precious metal, by gold, by silver. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we're here for tonight. That's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about that, and we want to talk also about the other half of the economic problem in our nation, and that is the huge American debt. But let's go back a little bit before that. Let's go back to what our country is all about. I love to bring around the Constitution of the United States. I always carry a copy with me. I like to share it with people. The copy that we've printed has also in it the Declaration of Independence. When our nation began, they wrote the Declaration. That's the philosophical underpinnings of our nation. Here you will find the philosophy. Later you find the nuts and bolts. What does it say? Well, the whole thing can be summed up right here at the beginning. It says, men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Stop right there. There is a God, according to our founding fathers, and it's He who gave us our rights, not government. That's a marvelous foundation. Then they went on in the next breath to define what governments are supposed to be. They said, to secure these rights, governments are instituted. And there you have the whole thing, the whole philosophical underpinnings of the United States. There is a God, and He gave us our rights, and we use our rights to form a government to protect our rights, not to redistribute the wealth, not to take control of the people, not to dominate their lives, not to make them slaves, simply to protect their rights. Well, we fought a war to make it stick, didn't we? And lo and behold, we won the war. We sent the British packing back across the ocean. And we had fought the war under the Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation. After it was all, after it was all over, they got together in 1787, did the Founding Fathers, to revise the Articles of Confederation, but out of it came a whole new constitution, a whole new governmental system, the Constitution of the United States of America. And the whole thing is right here. Look how few pages. You know it couldn't have been written by government today. Right? No doubt about that. If it was, it would be that high off the floor, wouldn't it? Now, whom does it limit? Does it limit you and me? No, it limits government. Strictly defined powers of government are there. Checks and balances, diffusion of powers, separation of powers, all leading towards leaving the people alone and having a government for the purpose of protecting their rights. And then they sent it back to the states for ratification. They didn't even ram it down their throats. And the different states began to debate whether to ratify it, and some of the states, chiefly North Carolina, said, we don't like this unless you add to it a statement of what we believe our rights to be, a Bill of Rights. Well, there was a promise made. The promise was, get the Constitution ratified and we'll add to it a Bill of Rights. And those were amazing days. The politicians kept their promise. So the Bill of Rights was offered. Now, you know what the Bill of Rights is. And everybody in our country's heard about the Bill of Rights. And you know about freedom of speech and freedom of press and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion. Even freedom to keep and bear arms. It's all part of the Bill of Rights. But you know, I hear people all across the country talking about the First Amendment rights and the Second Amendment rights and so on. And I always try to stop them. I say, wait a minute, you know, there's a better way of putting it. It would be better if you said your God-given rights protected by the First or the Second or the Fifth and so on. And then you will convey what really is the American system, because we didn't get any rights from the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights says Congress shall make no law respecting them, because they had already recognized that they had been granted by God. Now, I also hear people saying that the First Amendment is the most important. Freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and so on. And I disagree with that as well. I think the Second Amendment is the most important, because it gives teeth to all of the others. The Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. That is there not for target shooters and hunters. It's there because the founding fathers of this nation knew that when the British marched out from Boston, where we are here today, toward Lexington and Concord, just a few miles up the road from us, that they were after the guns of the farmers. And the farmers resisted, and the farmers said, if that's what they want, then they really do want our freedom, and we must resist. And so they did resist at the Lexington Green and at the Concord Bridge, and there began the war for independence that led to the creation of the greatest experiment in human liberty, the United States of America. And we are its beneficiaries. That's Americanism. That's what really it's all about. And let's realize that if this Constitution were fully enforced, the government of the United States would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. There is no authorization here for foreign aid. There is none for funding the United Nations. There is none for international entanglements. There is none for a Department of Education, a bureau of this, a commission of that, an agency of something else. It is just not here. And if the Constitution were fully enforced, the government would indeed be 20% its size and 20% its cost. And wouldn't that be nice? Well, that's Americanism, but we have the opposite of it coming more and more to the fore, don't we? They've thrown God out of the picture in many places. You can't even teach the concepts in the Declaration of Independence in the government schools today. Imagine. Imagine if one of those 56 men who signed this came back and said, you mean you've allowed the government to throw out the most fundamental premise of the whole Declaration? That men are endowed by their Creator with rights? You've allowed them to do that? And they would look at us and say, for shame. And we would have to hang our heads in shame. No God, then people believe their rights come from government. And of course, the corollary to that is that if a government gives you your rights, the government can take them away. And it will. Then they go on and they start frittering away our national independence. They want centralized government. They want world government, some of these people. They want the United Nations. Indeed, there are people who want world tyranny run by them. This is the way our America is being led today, turning on her past. And the John Birch Society says it's not an accident. The John Birch Society says it's deliberate. It's a conspiracy. And there is that horrible word, conspiracy. And there are people all along the way who say, you shouldn't use that word. Why not? It was useful during the Watergate conspiracy, wasn't it? If we could use it then, why can't we use it today? We believe it, and so therefore we say it. Now, who are some of the people involved in promoting the things that we're talking about here? Who are some of the people that are leading us away from what our country is supposed to be? Well, there are many of them, and we could talk about many over recent years. But let's focus today on Mr. William Clinton, Mr. Bill Clinton, the President of the United States. Bill Clinton gave his acceptance speech for the Democrat nomination in the summer of 1992 to a nationally televised audience. And in his speech, he paid a little bit of homage to one of his professors at Georgetown University, a man named Carroll Quigley. He mentioned him by name. And when he did, every member of the John Birch Society from coast to coast said, did you hear what he said? He said Carroll Quigley. We know who Carroll Quigley was. We know a lot about Carroll Quigley. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Carroll Quigley. Carroll Quigley is the man who wrote this book, a 1,350-page book called Tragedy and Hope, The History of the World in Our Time, published in 1966. When it was published, Bill Clinton was a sophomore at Georgetown University, and Mr. Quigley, Professor Quigley, a professor at Georgetown. Now, the fact that he mentioned him in his speech would indicate certainly that he was influenced by Quigley. Whether he read the book fully or not, I don't know. I'm sure he attended some of his classes. He became imbued with the thinking of Carroll Quigley. What was that thinking? Well, Carroll Quigley spends great amounts of time in his book talking about the creation of a secret society to rule the world. I didn't make it up. It's here in the book. A secret society to rule the world. He traces its beginnings at 1870 in Oxford University in England. The John Birch Society would go beyond that in history, but we'll go along with what Quigley is telling us. He tells us that in 1870, a professor named John Ruskin arrived on the scene at Oxford, and he took the campus by storm. He had all of the undergraduates that he was teaching. He was telling them over and over again that they were the members of a privileged and ruling class. He told them that they were the possessors of a magnificent tradition of education and beauty and law, and that the world would be far better off if it were run by them. The student among all of his students who was most taken with the ideas of John Ruskin was a young man named Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes would then later go to Southern Africa, and with the help of the Rothschild banking empire, according to Quigley, become fabulously wealthy, exploiting the diamond mines, the gold mines, all through southern Africa. They even named a country after the man, didn't they? Rhodesia, which then became Zimbabwe. Cecil Rhodes used his great wealth to form the secret society that John Ruskin had suggested. Quigley tells us that the purpose centered on the desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all of the habitable portions of the world under their control. He went on to talk about the fact that they created an inner circle and then an outer circle. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a conspiratorial tactic. The outer circle doesn't usually know that the inner circle exists. The inner circle, he said, was formed in 1891. And by 1919, they were now forming the outer circles. They started with the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England, and then similar institutes of international affairs in the British Dominion countries of New Zealand and Australia and South Africa. And then he tells us that there was a similar institute of international affairs created in the United States called the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, the Council on Foreign Relations deserves a little attention because Mr. Clinton comes from the Council on Foreign Relations. And so do about 400 of the people who are serving in his administration. And so do the leaders of all of the mass media in our country. The newspapers, the magazines, the television networks, all led by people in the Council on Foreign Relations. And so do the military leaders. And so do the people who lead the academic institutions and the foundations, and a lot of corporate giants. There's only 3,000 individuals in the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a private organization in New York City, membership by invitation only. I haven't been invited. I doubt that I'd accept if I were. The Council on Foreign Relations was actually chartered in our country in 1921. And we have a man who wrote a book after studying their papers for all of their history, from 1921 right up till today. And he wrote a book about them, and he said that their goal was socialism and world government. He said that what they intended was to bring about a world tyranny, and he used as evidence to back up his claim their own statements. Not hearsay. He went to the primary source, their own documents. Quigley goes on to tell us that they were constantly harping on the lessons to be learned from the failure of the American Revolution. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I don't think it was a failure. I think it was a grand success. I mean, if it had failed, we'd all be still under the British crown. I wouldn't care for that, not only because I'm of Irish-American ancestry, but that does enter into it to some degree. Now, Quigley finally gets around to telling us, some 300 pages into the book, what the overall goal was. And I'll read it to you. The goal was nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. And every time I read that, I say, wow, what an ambitious undertaking. Nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, that's key, private hands, like the Federal Reserve, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Isn't that consistent with what Meyer Amschel Rothschild had said? Give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes its laws. Very consistent. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what's happening to us. That's what's happening to the entire world, in fact. Well, Carroll Quigley went on for many, many hundreds of pages. Here, towards the end of his book, he said, I know of the operations of this secret network. Sometimes he called it a secret society, sometimes a secret network, because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. He never told us where he went to study its papers and secret records. It would have been very interesting to know. And then he said, I have no disagreement with it. The only problem I have is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I think its role in history is significant enough to be known. And so Carroll Quigley never used the word conspiracy. You see, a conspiracy has 3 elements: secrecy, more than one, and evil. If it's secrecy and more than one, and he doesn't believe it to be evil, he doesn't use the word conspiracy. And that's an honest view. And Carroll Quigley was telling us what he had honestly come on through all of his years of research. And his book obviously was intended for academic institutions and bright young students like Bill Clinton when the John Birch Society discovered it. And all of a sudden, we were buying more copies than anybody. Members of our society said, I've got to read this. This is corroboration for the views of the John Birch Society, even as far back as 1966. Yes, yes. And so we started buying many, many copies of it. It was determined that that was the case. And so when time came to reprint the book, the Macmillan Company decided they weren't going to reprint it. And Quigley was furious. He wanted his masterpiece spread around. He was very proud of it. But because he was telling tales out of school, it was suppressed by not being reprinted. He eventually got the rights to it away from Macmillan, gave it to a fellow on the West Coast, and it was republished, and it is still available. It can be had. Now, Quigley discussed at great length in a second book that he wrote, the legacy of Cecil Rhodes. That other book is called The Anglo-American Establishment. This was published after he passed away. It was published in 1981, in fact. And he talked about Cecil Rhodes and the fact that Cecil Rhodes had left 7 separate wills. The man was so wealthy that he left 7 wills. I'm sure that there are several people in this audience who are in the same fix, and I hope you leave at least one of them to the John Birch Society. 2 of those wills went to establish the Rhodes Scholarship Program. And so Quigley tells us about the Rhodes Scholarship Program in this book, and I'll only read one sentence from it. It says, the scholarships were merely a facade to conceal the secret society. Or, more accurately, they were to be one of the instruments by which the members of the secret society could carry out the purposes of Cecil Rhodes. Now there it is, and there's from the man that Bill Clinton himself praised as his mentor. So what happened? Well, Bill Clinton finished Georgetown, aspired to and became a Rhodes Scholar. And he spent several years over there studying. He never finished the program. He was too busy running around protesting the war in Vietnam. He came back to America and he went to Yale Law School. That, incidentally, is where he met, what's her name? That's where he met his wife. Finished Yale Law School, went back to Arkansas, ingratiated himself into politics, became the governor of the state, and then was invited to become a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And then was invited to become a member of its stepchild, the Trilateral Commission, that was formed in 1973. And then in 1991 was brought to Europe to attend a meeting of the Bilderbergers. Now I know every audience that I speak to, there are some people who say, Bilderbergers, what's that? You know? And do you get them at Wendy's or Burger King or McDonald's, or where do you? What is the Bilderbergers? Well, in 1954, David Rockefeller, who was to become the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations and the founder of the Trilateral Commission, decided to get together with his friend Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and between them they would invite the leaders of Western Europe and the United States to an annual meeting. And the annual meeting's purpose was to decide how the world should be run. The first meeting was held in 1954 in the town of Oostbeek in the Netherlands at the Hotel de Bilderberg. And ever since then, the meetings have been called the Bilderberg meetings. Now, every year, the gathering is held, and top individuals from Western European nations and ours go, and they take over a plush resort somewhere. They put up guards around the place, nobody in, nobody out during the 3 or 4 days they gather. Nobody attributes what goes on to the press, although some things have leaked out. And they decide how the world should be run. Now, occasionally, some people are trotted before them and are showcased. In 1991, the meeting was held at Baden-Baden in Germany, and Bill Clinton went along. And Bill Clinton obviously got a nod of approval from these people and came back and was permitted to be the President of the United States. And that's the way it works, ladies and gentlemen. Believe me. George Bush had preceded him as a Bilderberg member. Many others have as well. Some have come back and not been so tapped and so given the nod of approval, but others have. I mean to tell you that those people have great influence over who is to be the nominee and who is to be the eventual winner of the presidency of the United States. Somewhat similar to what the Federal Reserve does. Now, Bill Clinton has all four of these credentials. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was in the Trilateral Commission, and once you take a federal job, then they list you as a former member in public service, but they still list them. And he's a member of the Bilderberg Group. In 1992, when he was running for the nomination, he had opposition, didn't he? There were 5 others running against him. For the primary season, they were Jesse Jackson and Jerry Brown and Senator Harkin from Iowa, Senator Kerry from Nebraska, and former Senator Tsongas from Massachusetts. Now, any one of those 4 could have said to the voters, to the people on the television debates and so on, don't vote for Bill Clinton. If you vote for Bill Clinton, you're going to get a duplicate of George Bush. They both come out of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderbergers. Don't vote for them, for Clinton, vote for me. How many of them did that? Not a one is correct. Not a one. Why? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that at least some of them would love those credentials for themselves. And they're certainly not going to hold it up for scorn. But there's another reason why they don't. In 1914, a book was published written by then President Woodrow Wilson. The book called The New Freedom. And in his book, he said, some of the biggest people in the United States are afraid of something. He continued, there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. That power existed way back in that period, and ladies and gentlemen, it still exists today, and it has grown more powerful. There's a little organization in the United States started in 1958 called the John Birch Society. And by 1961, it was not only speaking above its breath about this, it was shouting it from the housetops. And so what happened? That power was unleashed against the John Birch Society. And every nasty thing you can imagine was said about the Birch Society. Racist, anti-Semite, crackpot, kook, fanatic, ultra, extremist, like the communists, like the Klan, like the Nazis, none of which had any substance whatsoever, then or ever. But the John Birch Society survived the withering smear campaign and is now again growing quite rapidly in influence and in numbers throughout the United States of America. We mean to tell the people of this country who is really running the show. And we know that there are many, many millions of Americans who are upset and who want to know what's really going on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what's really going on is that we are being driven into the New World Order. And when George Bush first started using that phrase in 1990, again, every member of the John Birch Society from coast to coast said to each other, did you hear what he said? Did you hear what he said? He said the New World Order. 25 years before, our founder, Robert Welch, had told us that this indeed was a slogan of an evil conspiracy, and that it meant economic control and political control. Economic control through socialism or communism, and political control through world government. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what's the driving force behind these people today. You know, I do a lot of radio shows, and many of them by telephone, and I don't know how many times over recent years I've been a guest on a radio show, and the talk show moderator would, in all honesty, he'd start off the program by saying, we're glad to have a representative of the John Birch Society today, Mr. McManus, welcome, and my first question for you is, what's the Birch Society doing now that communism is dead? It's happened many, many times. And it's an honest question in many cases, sometimes a little snide, I guess, a little bit of a snicker about it. And my response is simply, look, why do you say communism is dead? It's alive in Cuba, it's alive in China, in North Korea, and in Berkeley, California, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a lot of other places. And then I'll ask the fellow, I say, you know, that nation that just imploded over there, that's the USSR, that stands for the Union of Soviet Communist Republics, doesn't it? And he'd shake his head. I could see him shaking his head, even though I might not have been with him by telephone. It stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And he'd grant me that. I say, well, the John Birch Society doesn't think that if a communist changes his mind and wants to call himself now a socialist, that we really should run up a victory flag. And then I'll ask him, I say, well, why don't you ask me to define socialism? Okay, he says, go ahead. Socialism is economic control of the people by government. It means taxation, regulations, controls, bureaucracy, big brother government, and invariably, before I finish, he says, well, that's what we're getting here. And I say, thank you very much, you've made my case. That's what we're getting here. Yes, indeed, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we're getting here. Then I would say to him, you know, there's a difference between socialism and communism. Would you like to hear it? He says, sure, what is it? I said, a communist is a socialist in a hurry. A communist means to seize control and impose socialism on you. And when he does so, 98, 99% of the people are his enemies. And he has to set up gulags and KGBs and terror and knocks on the door in the middle of the night. But a socialist will work more slowly, and he'll get you to vote yourself into the condition and destroy resistance in the process. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what's happening to our country. We're being persuaded to vote ourselves into the condition that the communists would have preferred to impose on us. But the goal of both is the same. The goal of both is, in fact, what Karl Marx gave us in the Communist Manifesto. And you know, we published the Declaration and the Constitution. And we also published the Communist Manifesto. We want people to read it. And if you read this edition that we've published, you'll see that we added to it a new preface written by Engels in 1888. You see, the original was produced in 1848. And on the 40th anniversary, Engels wrote a new preface for it. Marx was already in his grave. And Engels tells us in the new preface that when it was written, we wanted to call it the Socialist Manifesto, but we didn't for several reasons, one of which was that there were some quacks running around Europe at the time calling themselves socialists, and we didn't want to have anything to do with them. You see, the goal of communists and socialists since 1848 has been the Communist Manifesto. It's the economic program. You combine this with the terror and the organization of a Lenin, you've got communism. You just leave it by itself, you've got socialism, and the goal is the same. Now, what does it say? Well, the theory may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. You can lose your private property in one fell swoop, or you can lose your private property incrementally through taxation and regulations and controls and bureaucracy. It goes on and it talks about the need to do away with the family, abolition of the family. Is the family under attack in our country? It says here, we must replace home education by social. That's an explicit attack on homeschooling, which is quite interesting. Here they say bourgeois marriage has to go. Here they say abolish nationalities and countries, abolish eternal truths, all religion, all morality. It's all here, and it's all happening in our country. And then you get to the famous 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, listed right here. All 10 of them. What are they? Well, number 2 is the heavy progressive income tax. We've got it. Number 5 is the Federal Reserve. There it is. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. And what we've got, it went one step beyond what Karl Marx called for. He said in the hands of the state, and we've put it in the hands of a private group. You go on, and what else do you see in the Communist Manifesto? Abolition of property and land. Land controls, land being taken away from people? Certainly. Abolition of the rights of inheritance. Every time there's a new tax bill, more abolition of the rights of inheritance. Finally, we get down to the 10th plank, free education for all children in public schools. Yeah, we have that too, which is why Karl Marx didn't want home education. Get all the children into the schools, and make sure you don't tell them that their rights come from God. Have them think that their rights come from government, and then, of course, government can take them away. Now, I contend that if you took the covers off these both of them, and you put them in front of some congressman, they wouldn't know the difference. In fact, if you put them in front of some congressman and you said to them, choose which one is the one that we are being guided by, some of them would look down here and they'd say, oh, income tax, yeah, we got that. Federal Reserve, yeah, we got that. Free education for all children, public schools, right? Inheritance, oh yeah, we got to get inheritance taxes and so on. Obviously, this is the one we're guided by. And ladies and gentlemen, they'd be correct, because this is the one that they're being guided by, whether they know it or not, and this is the one that they've taken the oath to and then put right up on a shelf somewhere. It's time for the American people to make them abide by their own oath. And that, of course, is part of what the John Birch Society is all about. They want the New World Order. How do you get the American people to accept that? How do you get the American people willing to go along and have themselves dragged into socialism and world government? Well, you corrupt some of them, and if you do that, you can control them. Corrupted people are easy to control. And then you buy some of them, and you buy them with government programs, government paternalism, government, all kinds of benefits. And you can even buy corporations, as they have bought with government contracts. But the greatest way of getting the American people to give up their liberty was to scare them. And so we had a series of scares. And the greatest of the scares has been communism throughout my lifetime. Communism building a great missile capability, aiming the missiles at American cities, American people being terrorized and being worried about this, and all of a sudden a lot of them submitting to a slogan that all of a sudden showed up all over the country. The slogan was, better red than dead. Wonderful alternatives, huh? Right? You can live under communism or you can become an ash in a nuclear holocaust. Are there no other alternatives? Well, certainly there are other alternatives. Stay free, live free, resist. Even say you'll fight if you have to maintain your freedom. Well, communism was a great threat. But communism isn't that great threat anymore, is it? We don't have that aimed at us anymore. I'm not saying it's gone completely. I'm saying that it's kind of on the shelf. It could come back tomorrow, excuse me. It could come back tomorrow from Red China. It could even come back from Russia. We should ask ourselves, how come no more of the scare of communism? And I don't know fully why, but I suspect that part of the reason is that for about 25 years, the John Birch Society and our members all across the country have been distributing literature and writing letters telling the American people that the communist missile scare was made in the West. And it was all a part of a conspiracy to force the American people into accepting more government and world government. You see, we gave them the plans, the parts, the technology, the equipment, the computers, the money, everything needed to build a missile capability to aim at us. It was made in the West. And our government kept saying, isn't it horrible? We've got to do something about this terrible communist program. So communism isn't that threat anymore. So then what's the next threat? Well, the next threat is environmentalism. Environmental hysteria, in fact. We're told all the time of terrible environmental cataclysms that are facing us. The chief of them for many years has been global warming. Now, I know here in the Northeast, if you say global warming over the last couple of months, you'd probably be laughed out of town. What did I do with my book? Here. Environmentalism, global warming. Let's talk about global warming for a minute here. The theory propounded is that you and I are burning too much fuel in our automobiles and in our factories and our homes. We're putting up stuff into the atmosphere. It's forming a canopy over the Earth. And therefore, the heat that's generated can't go off into space. The Earth is heating up. And pretty soon, the polar ice caps are going to melt. And you're going to have oceanfront property in Pittsburgh or, I don't know, something. Well, it's not that ridiculous. It's almost that ridiculous. The truth of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, that temperature recordings have been made at tens of thousands of stations every single day all over the Earth for over 100 years. And the data is available. And the data shows no warming and no cooling. Yes, you'll have a cooler winter and then a warmer winter. Yes, you'll have a cooler summer and then a warmer summer. But average it out over just a few years, and there is no change. There is no threat from global warming. But every time they tell us about this threat, they say it's an international problem, and we've got to have international controls. And if it's not global warming, it's ozone depletion, which can also be shown to be complete hysteria. Or it's something else. They've got all kinds of threats. They're trotting before us all the time. They say the rainforest, or who knows what, acid rain, you name it. And competent scientists have been speaking about these things for quite a few years now. Scientists who usually speak to themselves in their scientific journals are speaking to the general public. There's been some wonderful books written by competent scientists to simply expose the fraudulent nature of all of these threats. So we ought to ask ourselves, well, where did all this come from? Where did all this environmental hysteria generate from? Well, let me tell you what we think. See, back in 1962, a series of meetings was convened in New York City, just north of it, a place called Iron Mountain. 15 individuals met on and off for a period of 3 years. And the purpose of the meetings over 3 years was to develop an alternative to nuclear weapons to scare the people of the world into total control. One of the 15 individuals who was at the meeting took the report that was put out at the end of the 3 years, which was not meant for public consumption. It was meant for the people within the group and their associates. And he took it to a publisher. The man's name was John Kenneth Galbraith. He's the only one that we've ever known was at those meetings. Well, it was published then. The report from Iron Mountain was published. And I want to read just one sentence for you here, and I think it explains, at least in part, the genesis of the environmental hysteria movement. It says here, it may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. Ladies and gentlemen, they even said apparent threat. You see, this wasn't for public consumption. Let me read it again. It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. I believe that to be the genesis of the environmental hysteria movement. Well, it hasn't taken. It's certainly dangerous. I think that there's a lot of problems that can come out of it, and we have to be on guard. We have to continue to tell our fellow citizens and warn them and put down some of this hysteria as it comes. Well, we've talked about one scare called communism and one scare called environmental hysteria. And I should tell you at this point that I consider myself an environmentalist. I want clean air. I want clean water. I'm repulsed if I drive down the highway and I see trash along the highway. And you do, and I do, and all of us do, but we don't need to give up our liberty to solve those problems. What's the next threat? The next threat isn't bogus. The next threat is debt. It's real. We now have a $4.5 trillion debt. You say $4.5 trillion to anyone, and it's just like a jet plane went by and it's gone. You know, what does it mean? $4.5 trillion. Let's talk about $1 trillion. If I owed $1 trillion and I intended to pay it off at the rate of $1 million a day, every day, with no interest being considered at all, it would take me 2,740 years to do it. That's what $1 trillion is. The admitted national debt is $4.5 trillion. And for it, we are now paying close to $300 billion in interest. And again, what does that mean? It goes by like, well, there's 250 million Americans, aren't there? A little long division, and what do you come up with? You come up with $1,200 for every man, woman, and child in this country every year, just for interest, and it's rising. And it doesn't pay any of the salaries of federal officials or the military. It doesn't lower the debt. It just pays interest. But you know, not everybody pays taxes, and when you factor out children and others who don't, you're about half. So double the $1,200 for taxpayers $2,400 a year, $200 a month just for interest on the national debt. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very simple what's going on here. Debt is followed by borrowing, and borrowing is followed by interest, and interest is followed by the need for taxation, and taxation gains control over the people by the government doing the taxing. Is the debt deliberate? I certainly believe it is. They tell us there's little they can do. We've got to have $200, $300 billion deficits year after year. It's incredible. President Clinton recently issued a budget, and he said we're going to have $176 billion deficit this year. We've held it to under 200. Aren't I wonderful? Alice in Wonderland. Look, Clinton vows more trims in spending. Right? What are they spending the money for? Well, ladies and gentlemen, $200 billion deficits, and they still give away money. We have a foreign aid program. $13 billion we give away. We have a commodity credit program. $25 billion we give away. And not only that, there's another form of foreign aid that nobody wants to talk about, and that's when the United States stations troops in foreign nations, and we accept their defense budget as ours. We have troops in Japan, South Korea, Germany. They're economic powers. Why can't they defend themselves? We have troops in Somalia. We have them in the Middle East. We have them in Macedonia. We have planes flying over what used to be Yugoslavia. I read in the paper recently where troops are just coming back from Colombia. I didn't even know they were there in the first place. What's the solution to all of that? It's very simple. Bring the troops home. Bring them all home. And when we bring them home, then we don't have that massive expense, and we don't have ourselves being sent down the slippery slope into United Nations control of our military and our entire nation, which is certainly what it's all about. I contend that if you go to a fourth grader, you go to a 10-year-old, maybe you know some, try it. You say to the 10-year-old, we're going to be about $200 billion in debt this year. Should we give away money? What would the 10-year-old say? Say no. You might even say, no, you dummy. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe we need fourth graders in Congress. Right? Maybe we'd be better off. What are they spending the money for? Well, I have a long list of things that they're spending the money for in my book. Let me just read a few. All right, we have $2 million to study why truck drivers lose alertness at the wheel. I could have saved them the money. They get tired. All right, what else are they spending it for? Where's my page here? Here I go. $49 million for a rock and roll museum. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. How about $1.7 million to study how to make killer bees less aggressive? $500,000 to study the effects of cigarette smoking on dogs. $603,000 for pickle research at the North Carolina State University. $2 million for a bicycle path between Arlington and Cambridge in Massachusetts. I suppose that's for the Harvard professors to ride their bikes to work. I don't know. $500,000 to McDonald's Corporation to promote chicken McNuggets. There's a company that really needs the money. $2.3 to the Gallo brothers to promote their wines. It's just incredible. It just goes on and on and on. African elephant conservation, $1.2 million. Elephants, huh? Maybe the Republicans were behind that one, I guess. I don't know. $11 million for the United States Institute of Peace to teach the people in our country to want peace. What an insult. People don't start wars. Governments start wars. They send the people to fight and die in the wars. If they spent the $11 million to get the governments to stop starting the wars, I'd be willing to expend the money. And it just goes on and on. Here's $34 million for the National Fertilizer Research Center, which I think ought to be located on Capitol Hill. And we now have them telling us that they want to take over the medical profession. They want to have the National Health Program. And Hillary Clinton went up to the Congress and she told them that her program would mean that all employers would be required to pay 80% of the cost of the program that she was putting out. And some of the congressmen and the senators said, Mrs. Clinton, that would be an enormous burden for many small and middle-sized companies. In fact, it would probably destroy them. And her incredible response to the congressman was the following: I cannot be responsible for saving every undercapitalized entrepreneur in America. Incredible. She would be responsible for destroying their businesses, wouldn't she? Where did she ever get the clout that she has? Stop and think for a minute. Suppose the CEO of a giant corporation had a wife who came and started telling the different division heads of the corporation how to do it. Would that be tolerated? Suppose the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had a wife who came to the Pentagon and started telling the admirals and the generals what they should be doing. Would that be tolerated? Why is this tolerated? Who elected her? Where did she get this kind of clout? Well, ladies and gentlemen, she should have been thrown right out of Capitol Hill when she said what she said. You know, you can sum up that whole healthcare thing. There's a bumper sticker running around now, and sometimes bumper stickers make an awful lot of sense. It says simply, if you think healthcare is expensive now, just wait till it's free. Just wait till it's free. They don't intend to cut the deficit. They don't intend to pay off the debt. They don't intend to reduce the tax burden. They don't intend to allow us to be free. Which brings me back to my book, Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America under the threat of bankruptcy. Under the threat of not bankruptcy itself, the threat. They intend to lead us right up to the door of bankruptcy and then say, we've got a solution for you. World monetary system, world government, the new world order. Has anybody ever said that? Yes, many of them have said it. Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1970 said it. He said, more intensive efforts to shape a new world monetary structure will have to be undertaken with some consequent risk to the present relatively favorable American position. Richard Nixon said it in 1972. There must be a thoroughgoing reform of the world monetary system. We must join with other nations to create and participate in a modern world economic order. See, all of these individuals, I got many of them from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Here's one from a man named C. Fred Bergston. He runs the International Economics something in Washington, D.C. I see their publications. It's quite interesting. In 1989, he said, the world economy is in trouble unless there is some central steering mechanism. A world Federal Reserve is exactly what they're aiming towards. And you know, there are some people who have opposed them and have pointed out exactly what they said. We certainly have. Others have. Here's a writer named Jeremiah Novak in 1977. He said this: the Trilateral Commission's most immediate concern is the creation of a new world monetary system to replace gold and the dollar as the international exchange with a new currency. He's right. And they're getting ready to do that to us. I've got a section in my book about the fact that we're constantly being given false alternatives. The missing alternative is economic freedom. But what are the alternatives they present to us? They say more debt or a world monetary system. Take your choice. See, Shakespeare had a way of looking at that. In The Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare said, there's small choice in rotten apples. Yeah, well put, Will, right? Are there any decent apples to choose from? Yes. How about economic freedom? How about less government? How about balancing the budget? How about paying off the debt? How about leaving the American people with the fruits of their labor? We've already talked about inflation that can ravage the country and that can lead you right up to the door of bankruptcy. One of the parts of the book that people have told me they find most fascinating is where I've got pictures of currency, going all the way back to the time when we had gold certificates issued by the U.S. Treasury. Here we see it says, United States Treasury, payable to the bearer of gold on demand. and you could get gold for that piece of paper. The finest paper money the world has ever seen. Well, that's gone, and then we went to silver certificates, again issued by the U.S. Treasury, and it said on it, silver, to the bearer on demand. And you could get silver for that, and that's gone too. We can't have that anymore. Well, we started getting Federal Reserve notes back after the Fed was formed in 1913, and the first of them circulated side by side with U.S. Treasury gold certificates. And so they said on them, redeemable in gold, and you could get gold for them. You see, the Federal Reserve said it was good for gold. The U.S. Treasury notes said it was good for gold. And the people said, well, one's as good as the other, and the acceptance of Federal Reserve notes was accomplished. Well, in 1933, President Roosevelt took us off the gold standard, said we couldn't even own gold anymore. So then they went to the next kind of money, the Federal Reserve note that says on it, redeemable in lawful money. What might that be? I tell a story in my book about a man who took a $50 Federal Reserve note that said redeemable in lawful money, and he went up to the teller at the bank, and he handed it in, and he said to the girl, I'd like some lawful money, please. And she said, do you want 5 10s or 10 5s? Well, he said, no, miss, if you'll look on that currency you want to give me there, you'll see that it too says redeemable in lawful money. If it's redeemable in lawful money, it can't be lawful money. That's quite logical. He said, I'd like some lawful money, and she went and got the boss. Well, the boss came back, and they haggled for a while. Finally, they said to him, sir, what is it you really want? And he said, I'd like some gold or some silver, please. Am I going to get that? They said, no. And he said, thank you, give me back my 50. You've proved my point, and out the door he went. And so the Fed then went to the next kind of currency. The last of the 5 that I've pictured is the kind you have in your pockets and purses today. And it says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Redeemable in nothing. And in my lifetime, plus 2 years, we've gone from the finest paper money the world has ever known to totally irredeemable paper. A Federal Reserve note is a non-redeemable note on a private bank. Just think of it in those terms. A non-redeemable note on a private bank is what you and I are using. And ladies and gentlemen, the value of those continues to sink as the Fed creates more money. The political system in our country continues to be dominated by them as they raise or lower or raise or lower the value of the currency, manipulate it just prior to an election. We go on and on and on. The Fed has to be abolished. We've got to get back to precious metal-backed currency issued by the United States Treasury, and the sooner we do it, the better off we'll all be. We've got to get back to the Constitution of the United States. Only to those government agencies fully authorized in the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment says, if we didn't give you power to do it, you can't assume it. But the 10th Amendment is up on the shelf with the rest of the Constitution, isn't it? I've got a section in here about the history of banking. I talk about the destruction or the abolition of a central bank that was formed back in the 18-teens, and Andrew Jackson became president, spent his 8 years of his presidency to get rid of it. And he did. He succeeded. And then he paid off the national debt. Our nation was solvent. And I like to say, where are you, Andrew, when we need you? Right? I've got a section about entitlements and the wonderful story about Chile and how they handled their entitlement program by privatizing Social Security and the health care system that they had. And they said to the people in Chile, if you want to continue in it, we'll continue to pay it off, which is what I would recommend. I don't want to abolish Social Security overnight. You couldn't do it. It would be cruel and it would be unjust. But it is equally unjust to force people into the system. And so I would say make it private, like they did in Chile. And you know what happened in Chile? All of a sudden, many, many people opted out of the government program, went into a private program. It cost them less, they got much better benefits out of it, and all the money that they put into the private programs was then available as a borrowing pool from which business and industry could borrow and build, and Chile took off. There have been magazine articles written about it. I've seen them in several. Reader's Digest even had one, and they called Chile El Boom. El boom. And you know, that could be done in our country tomorrow. And we could begin to get out of the morass that they've got us in. Well, we can talk about the problems, and certainly are plenty, and we could keep doing it, but how about the solution? Is there a solution to this? Is there anything that we can do to keep ourselves free and to get our country back into the hands of those who want to be free? Yes, indeed. In fact, it's chapter 13 in my book. I call it Lucky 13. We have a brilliant program. We say the essence of brilliance is simplicity. And so we have a very simple program. And it has two steps. And the first step is to go right back to the Constitution and go to Article 1, Section 7. All of the Constitution is still here. And if we want to, we can force them to abide by it, which is why we don't want a constitutional convention, by the way. You start a constitutional convention, you kiss this goodbye. So long. All right, what does it say? Article 1, Section 7. All bills for raising revenues shall originate in the House of Representatives. Stop right there. If the House of Representatives will not initiate a bill for funding foreign aid, or the United Nations, or the Bureau of this, the Department of that, or some other boondoggle, there's nothing anybody can do about it. The President can't, the Senate can't, the courts can't. The power of the purse is in the House of Representatives, deliberately done by the founders, because that's the body of government closest to the people, and you can change it every second year. Step 1. All bills for raising revenues shall originate in the House. Step 2 is to have enough House members willing to use that power to stop the juggernaut that is leading us down the road. How do we do that? Well, we do that with TRIM bulletins. We have a program called TRIM, Tax Reform Immediately, TRIM. And we put out report cards on the congressman. We put them out on every congressman all across the United States. Did he vote for higher taxes and more government? If he did, like this one, then he gets an X in all of the right-hand column. If he voted for lower taxes and less government, like this congressman, then he gets a star in the next to last column. This congressman voted for high taxes and more government on every occasion. This one voted for low taxes and less government. And the standard is the Constitution of the United States. Now, what would happen if tens of thousands, 50,000, 100,000 of these are distributed throughout the districts? Well, then an awful lot of people would now know what the congressman is doing. And sad to say, an awful lot of people would know who their congressman is for the first time. Well, this is being done 3 times a year. We publish these things for all 435 congressmen. We put them out 3 times a year. There's usually 8 measures that are reported on, and all 435 on this 8, and then all 435 on the next 8, and the next 8, and so on. Well, who are some of these people? Well, here's Mr. Gedenson from Connecticut. All X's, all big government, all spender and everything. He happens to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. What a surprise. Here's Mr. Gephardt from Missouri. All X's again. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, what do we got? Have we got anybody starred? Well, yeah, I showed you one. Here's one from Arizona. All stars. He voted for low taxes, less government, every occasion. Here's another one, all stars, from Illinois. Here's another one, all stars, from Wisconsin. Here's another one, all stars, from New York, right nearby. That's Gerald Solomon. His home office is where? Saratoga Springs, New York. This man keeps a pile of these on his receptionist's desk. And when the lobbyists come by and the leadership of the party comes by and they say, we want you to go along with this and we want you to go along with that, he said, well, you know, if you pick up one of those bulletins out there, you'll see that there's a very active group in my district, and they're constantly putting out the voting record of meself, as the Irish might say. And he said, I think I'm more beholden to them than I am to you, so take one of those with you and get out of here. Right? Wouldn't it be wonderful if more congressmen would do that? But ladies and gentlemen, that's being done here and there across the country. Let me show you what can happen. Let me first make the point that these bulletins never tell anybody to vote for or against. That's up to the voters. This is voter education. That's all it is. We don't even say if they're Republican or Democrat. In 1992, there's a congresswoman from Missouri named Joan Kelly Horn. And this is one of her trim bulletins. She usually had all X's. right? This particular one, she had one vote with a star, and the rest were all X's. And the people in that district started passing them out all over the place, all during 1992. They took ads out in the local newspaper and inserted them as an insert. They hung them on the doorknobs in a plastic bag. They put them in little plastic sacks, dropped them alongside the newspaper in the driveway. They set up tables at the shopping malls. They went to the county fair in the summertime. They passed them out everywhere. Everybody in the district saw what was happening. And when election day came in 1992, she became unemployed. And the man who took her place, Mr. James Talent, the first trim bulletin come out for him, and he had all stars. Completely different voting pattern. He voting for less taxes and less government on every occasion. Well, just think about what could be done here. That same thing happened in a district in South Carolina. It happened in a district in Alabama, another one in Oklahoma, another one in Minnesota, another one in Pennsylvania. Up in Iowa, there were two congressmen who were forced to run against each other because Iowa had lost a seat in the electional redistricting. And so the two congressmen, one had all stars on a trim bulletin, the other had all X's, and the people in the district simply took out a big ad in the local newspaper, put the two trim bulletins side by side in the newspaper, and guess who won? The man with the stars won. Here are a couple of congressmen from Massachusetts. Mr. Edward Markey. Oh, all X's. Way to go, Ed. Joseph Moakley. All X's. Isn't that something, huh? You know, one of my predecessors in the leadership of the John Birch Society explained really what goes on in Congress. The man's name was Larry McDonald. He was a 5-time congressman from Georgia. And he happened to be aboard KAL 007 in September of 1983. We never saw him again. But he used to tell us what was going on in Congress. And he said, you know, if you wanted to, you could divide Congress into 3 bodies, and you should. He said there's one body that will always vote for big government, more socialism, world government, and so forth. They follow the Marxist program, whether they know it or not. He said, you're not going to change their views. That's what they're committed to doing. He says there's 100 of them, 110, maybe even 125 of them. He said, you go to the other side, he said there's a whole body over here that will always vote for lower taxes, less government, the Constitution, limited government, and so forth. He said, there's not as many of them, but there's 60, 70, maybe 75, he says. So he said, take the high number of both of these bodies, 125 here, 75 here, you got 200, but there are 435 congressmen. He said, that leaves the largest body in the middle, 235 of them that have no ideological perspective. All they're interested in doing is staying in office. And he used to give it the wet finger test. That's what he always said. He'd go like this. And he'd hold his finger up. And he said, you do that, and the finger, all of a sudden, one part of your finger becomes cooler. Because that's where the breeze is coming from. And he said, it's time to have the breeze come from the other side, isn't it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's just think about this. Let's think about trim activity like this in many districts across the United States. And in the elections of 1994, maybe 15 or 18 seats change hands because the people have been educated about what their congressman is doing and they choose somebody differently. Let's suppose that that same thing happens in 1996. 15, 18, 20 more. I contend that that would be enough to change the momentum and have those that are in the middle going this way instead of that way. The momentum would be changed. In fact, I like to say that trim bulletins all by themselves can terrorize Congress into supporting its oath to the Constitution of the United States of America. There's the program. Does it work? I've already shown you that it works. I've already told you. The Birch Society has had this program going for quite a while, but only in the last couple of years have we put a lot of emphasis on it. Only in the last several years have many more millions of trim bulletins been distributed in the districts across the United States. The program is growing and growing very dramatically, and Congress is sitting up and taking notice. When I travel the country, I'm amused to find some of the ways that this is being done over in Ohio. They have a fairly large trim operation going over there, so they have a fairly large trim bulletin, see? Right? And I thought that that was as large as you could be until I went down to North Carolina, where they had a really large trim effort down there. Excuse me. This particular situation is quite dramatic. Down there, they printed up 50,000 of these, and they inserted them in the local newspaper. They paid to have them as an insert. Just 50,000 in one newspaper. And 4 days after they were distributed, this particular congressman announced that he was retiring and he wasn't going to run for re-election. There are open seats today because of the fear of trim, where somebody can be the new congressman for the district. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it works, and it can be done. You go to a lot of Birch Society meetings over the years. Maybe you've come out of them with a little bit of a heavy heart, and maybe you've said to yourself, there's a lot of problems here, a lot of problems that we've got to solve. We can't listen to the economists, right? We can't listen. Here's a newspaper clipping I picked up. It just drives me nuts, right? Some economists defend deficit spending. Wonderful. I got a solution to this, right? If you took all the economists and you laid them end to end, that would be fine. And I know that's a generalization, and some of them are good, and I shouldn't have overgeneralized. But, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you some hope. Can we do the job? I've got 5 reasons for hope, and I'm not a Pollyanna. What are those? Well, the first is that if you're working hard on something and you're doing it right and you're doing it and it's a moral, needed, necessary, important thing, and you ask for the help of the Almighty, I can't imagine that you won't get it. But if you sit back and you say, God, we got a terrible problem here, please come solve it, I can't imagine that He will. My mother used to say, God helps those who help themselves. And I think there's a lot of hope there. A second reason for hope is that history is made by the dedicated few. Indeed. And no one knows that better than a conspiracy that has an awful lot of people dancing to its tune. Why not an equally determined small group of people to undo what they are doing? Indeed, history is made by the dedicated few. Another reason for hope is that there's more good people than bad people, and nobody wants to be a slave. Let's reach those good people. Let's get them some good information. Let's enlist their help in a program that can regenerate our country and keep us free out of the clutches of the New World Order. A fourth reason for hope, we've got truth on our side. What a marvelous advantage we have. We have truth on our side. But it's only good if we wield it. It's only good if we go to the tops of the roofs and shout it out, pass it out, distribute it, talk to people with the truth. And if you do it, people will respond. And the fifth reason for hope, it's kind of a surprise to many. The fifth reason for hope is that it is a conspiracy. And the reason that that's hope is that it's not the evolution of historical forces or economic forces that nobody can stop. That's Marxist determinism and gibberish. Forget it. Forget it. Things happen because someone wants them to happen, and what's being done by some can be undone by others. Let's go and undo it. Because it is a conspiracy is a very good reason for hope. Well, let me wind this all up then. Wind this all up with discussion of a man who's become a hero of mine of sorts. I've done a little study about him. He was a great sculptor. He lived 400 years ago. His name was Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, over 400 years ago, received a 14-foot-high block of marble that had been discarded by others. Others had said that it had a flaw in it. He said, no, let me have it, please. And he began to work on it. He began to take his little hammer and chisel, and he started chipping away on it. And there was a boy in the neighborhood that used to come by, and he'd see him, and day after day he'd see him chipping away. And the boy finally said, after seeing this day after day after day, he finally said, this guy going nowhere. And he stopped coming by. But about a year and a half, he came back, and he looked in, and there was the magnificent statue of David. And the boy, in all innocence, looked at Michelangelo and he said, "How did you know he was in there?" Well, Michelangelo knew because he had a vision. And the vision spawned the labor, and it made up for the time and the effort and the seemingly endless frustration of chipping away with very little to show for it. And then finally it began to take form and then shape, and then he roughed it down, and then he polished it off, and he had his masterpiece, that magnificent statue of David, because he was willing to work hard enough and long enough and smart enough to see his vision become a reality. Well, I tell you that because the John Birch Society has a vision too. We have a vision of more individuals being elected to the Congress in 1994 who mean it when they take the oath to that Constitution. Our vision proceeds with more of them in 1996. Enough of them, in fact, so that the momentum does swing. And when Congress convenes in 1997, we see people there who are saying no to appropriating this and money for that and funding this and using the power that's there in the Constitution to stop the plunge towards fiscal suicide. We see them even repealing legislation, although in many cases legislation does not have to be repealed. It simply has to be defunded. And maybe at that point down the road, we'll take our trim stationery and we'll write a letter to every senator and we'll say, "Dear Senator, we're from Trim, and we're about to start putting out report cards on the senators. Stand by. Yours truly, Trim." And the vision continues so that by the year 2000 we could see elected to be the chief executive of the nation somebody that everyone in this room would be proud to call the President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, help us. Help us to realize our vision. Help us to turn a world gone crazy back to sanity once again. Help us to have that Constitution of the United States honored as it should be and abided by the senators, the congressmen, the president. Help us to bring about an era of less government and more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Can it be done? Absolutely, it can be done. And so I'll close as our founder, Robert Welsh, also closed so many meetings that he conducted with the simple urging to everyone to come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. Thank you very much.